All right, we're on 3:30, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, if you're on Central or Eastern Time. Good evening, everyone. This is Anu Advani from the California Comprehensive Center at WestEd. On behalf of the Secondary Literacy Partnership, I welcome you for our webinar, Content Literacy in History Social Science. We're excited to host the 6th webinar in our Secondary Literacy Partnership series. Our webinar director, Julie Duffield, will be facilitating the discussion in the chat. Also on today's webinar, we have Stacy Greer from CDE. We have an event page where you can download the PDF and the activity handout. We're excited to have you with us today. I would like to now turn it over to Stacy Greer, who is in the Literacy, History, and Arts Office of the California Department of Education. Stacy, who has a master's degree in history from UC Davis, is an important part of the Secondary Literacy Partnership team and has been planning and organizing this webinar series. Stacy will introduce today's presenter and the agenda. It's over to you, Stacy.
Thank you, Anu. It's such a pleasure to be here with our History Social Science folks. Just a clarification, I have my master's from Sac State, but I did work at UC Davis for almost 10 years, so that's where that gets a little bit confusing. But it's such a joy to be here as part of the Secondary Literacy Partnership. This partnership has been working together for approximately 15 years, and currently our members are the Association of California School Administrators, the California Teachers Association, and the California Comprehensive Center at WestEd. So these 4 organizations have been working together to host secondary literacy summits, and this is our 3rd year in our secondary literacy webinar series. And we've been working primarily focused on implementing the Common Core state standards through these webinar series. And it is really my pleasure to introduce today's speaker today. Do you want to move the next slide? Thank you. Shannon Hutton is a dear friend of mine. I've worked with Shannon Hutton for approximately 15 years already. I can't believe it's been that long. Shannon and I first met when she was a graduate student at UC Davis working on her PhD in history. And she brought such a level of wisdom to the programs I was participating in because she had been a long, very accomplished teacher in Vallejo City Unified. So she brought this perspective of a history teacher together with the research and analysis of looking at it through the historical lens of a scholar. So she and I have worked together on numerous projects, including some of what you're going to see here. But she has since led the work, a lot of the work in the California History Social Science Project's blueprint efforts that she's going to be presenting today. And we'd like to look at the agenda for today. We're going to be looking at Section 1. We're going to look at close reading, citing evidence, and writing, focusing on Ibn Battuta in Quanzu from 7th grade world history. And then Shannon's going to take us through an activity analyzing point of view and citing evidence, what happened at I always say that wrong, Malai. Section 3, analyzing point of view and change over time, citing evidence and writing from Lincoln's speeches. And finally, we'll look at some resources and next steps.
All right, thank you very much, Stacy, for that generous introduction of our presenter. I just want to check in with you now if you are familiar with or have used the California History Social Science Project's History Blueprint Lesson Plans. If so, click the yes, check for yes or the X for no. And if you have used these, please share which one and your experience in the chat. You can also type yes or no in the chat. Okay, I see the majority of people are saying no, and about 4 times as many no's as yeses. So now you have an opportunity to find out more about them and how to download them. And we'll go back to a multiple choice poll, and we want to find out a little bit about what you're most interested in as far as the topics of this webinar. So please answer the multiple choice poll, which appears in the poll panel on the right. Okay, and there are about 20 more seconds to respond to that. And again, if you're not able to do that poll in the poll panel, just type it in the chat. We have majority of you who've answered are interested in option A, close reading, citing evidence, and writing. Then it's analyzing point of view, and then change over time. So thank you very much for sharing with us your interests. And then I'm going to turn it over to Shannon Hutton, who's going to take you through today's presentation and discussion. Shannon, it's over to you.
Oh, hello, everybody. My name is Shannon Hutton, and I want to thank Stacy for that nice introduction. We have worked together for a long time. I was a high school history teacher, 10th grade world history, for 15 years before I went back to graduate school. And I've retained a very strong interest in teaching in the K-12 schools, as you might imagine. And I'd like to talk with you today about it looks like I'm going to give you lots of separate lessons today and separate strategies, when actually I'm going to show you what you can do with 3 core strategies, that is close reading, citing evidence, and writing, what you can do to both advance history social science instruction and to advance Common Core instruction with using historical primary sources. So actually, each of the activities that I will take you through are going to focus on the same core of skills, but also perhaps other skills along the way. So it's a good thing you want to know about close reading, citing evidence, and writing, because I promise to give you quite a bit on that subject. All right, first off, I would like to know from you, what challenges do your students face when they read historical primary sources as informational text? Now, you may not have direct experience with this, but if you kind of think back to what it's like to have a historical primary text, perhaps something like the Declaration of Independence or laws from Hammurabi's Code, or perhaps President Truman's address to the nation on the Truman Doctrine, anything along those lines. What if you gave your students a piece of text, a historical primary text, what problems would that cause for them? I'm going to give you a little time to write and then resume. All right, now what I'm seeing for people is that their students struggle with the vocabulary. Oh, and then the sentence structure of 18th and 19th century primary sources, extremely difficult. Students have trouble with decoding. They have trouble with historical context, the point of view. The materials are strange, and it's tough to have a connection between then and now. They have difficulty in just comprehending the text. So all of these things are really, really difficult. Then academic language is a problem with them. Academic language is a huge deal in history and social science. History and social science uses so many large words that actually linguists have a name for it. They say it's nominalization. We turn everything into a very complex long noun and to summarize the process, and it really does throw our students. All right, there are lots of difficulties with primary sources, and that's what I want to talk with you today, how to help students through those difficulties. And I also would like to tell you, though, that these historical primary sources are actually ideal informational texts. That is, They are definite, genuine materials. In fact, a lot of the assessments use a history social science text or what we might call current policy documents for testing. And also, for a history social science teacher, having your students read these texts also satisfies the history social science content standards at the same time as you're doing Common Core work. So for these reasons, it's worth it to have them read the primary sources. I want to next go briefly over the Common Core state standards that I will be showing you activities in relation to in this webinar. Now, I'm going to focus on 3 of the Common Core standards for literacy in history social studies. All right, the first is citing specific textual evidence to support analysis of primary and secondary sources. That is, we want to get students to use information from the text that is actually evidence and not a generalization, and to use it to support their analysis. And there are a whole host of skills that go along with using evidence effectively in speaking and writing. Then the second one is to determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in a text, including vocabulary describing political, social, or economic aspects of history social science. And you have pointed out that that is a very, very difficult challenge for our students to determine the meaning of those words and phrases. And then the third thing that our documents and activities will help students with today is on comparing the point of view of 2 or more authors for how they treat the same or similar topics. Or as we might say, comparing perspectives. There's a lot of historical writing. It all comes from a perspective, and one of the things we want to do is expose students to as many perspectives as we can. Then there are also writing standards for literacy in history, social studies, science, and technical subjects at the secondary level. I abbreviated these drastically, but because there's lots of pieces, of course, going into writing. But essentially what we'll be looking at is the 2 different kinds of writing that relate to informational text. One is to write an argumentative text, a text with an argument supported with evidence, and the second, which is to write informative or explanatory text in order to support it. So these are the writing standards we'll be looking at. Next, I want to take you briefly through the English language development standards. Now, these standards are not, they're for English learners, and they are not separate from the Common Core standards. They are meant to help English language learners access the Common Core standards, to bring them to the point where they can practice the skills of the Common Core standards. So these are meant to be supplementary, and if you look at them, you will see that they are going exactly along the same lines as the Common Core is. So we'll be looking at 3 different English language development standards in support of the Common Core standards. The first is one of the interpretive standards, reading closely literary and informational text and viewing multimedia to determine how meaning is conveyed explicitly and implicitly through language. So this is your close reading idea. Okay, and then another interpretive one, number 8, analyzing how writers and speakers use vocabulary and other language resources for specific purposes to explain, persuade, entertain, etc., depending on modality, text type, purpose, audience, topic, and content area. Now, why I would have given you a short version of this particular one, except that one of the things that we'll see in the activities today is there are lots of different text types and purposes in the documents, that the primary sources that I'm going to show you today. So helping an English learner negotiate and figure out how to handle a particular text type is a great way of just helping them be able to access and make use of particular primary sources. And finally, productive, number 10, that is writing literary and informational text to present, describe, and explain ideas and information using appropriate technology. So we'll be looking at how English learners, how these English language development standards can help your English learners access the Common Core, and make sense of the primary sources you'd like them to read for history and social science. All right, I have some advice on using primary sources, and while I am going through this advice, would you please answer the little quick poll here? Are you using historical investigation questions as a frame? Okay, if so, please feel free to share in the chat. All right, first off, I have some global advice on using primary sources, and I will return to these at the end. The first advice I have is keep them short. That is, most of them are long, and the shorter you can make them, the easier it is for your students. The younger your students are, the shorter you should have them. That is, they can handle, there are two advantages you have here. One is if you keep them short, the students feel less threatened, and two, it takes less time to get through them because you really want students to understand instead of having them do the complete test. All right, second, before you do before you assign it to students, be really, really clear in your own mind what you want them to learn. If you are clear on what they are to get out of it, they will be more clear. And third, frame it around the historical investigation question. That is, give them an interesting and gripping question to answer using the document. All right, and I will be demonstrating this to you in our lesson. And then the fourth thing, be willing to invest time. That is, you're not going to be able to do this in the 2 days that are allotted for, you know, covering a particular standard in history, social science. So if the biggest message I have for you, if you're going to do it, it's going to take time to do it, but that time is well worth being invested. Okay, so
Shannon, just reporting back on the poll, of the 62 people on the call, 8 have said yes, they are using historical investigation questions as a frame. 4 have said not yet, and some folks are sharing in the chat about using essential questions to frame the historical investigation units.
Wonderful, wonderful. That is great. We certainly have found that to be very useful as well. Okay. Now, support for English learners. When you work with your English learners, there also are some things that you should keep in mind. First, they need even shorter text, or perhaps they need highlighted sentences or bolded sentences in the text you give other students to have them work on maybe a sentence or two. They need vocabulary definitions and or activities. It's better not to front load these things, researchers tell us now. It's better to incorporate them in the lesson itself. They also need sentence-level comprehension activities. That is, not so much to help them analyze something, but to have them really understand the text. And it can be very, very helpful to have them work in groups or pairs in order to share their information and get clues from the other people in the group or their partners. All right, so I am going to take you, now that we have our global suggestions and our standards, take you through the first set of primary sources and the first set of activities that I have for you today. And this is from a 7th grade unit in our called Sites of Encounter in the Medieval World. The idea of this unit is that it covers the period between 1000 and 1500 across Afro-Eurasia, and it focuses on the interconnections between the different regions in Afro-Eurasia in that time period. The second lesson in that unit is about the city of Quanzhou in China. You may have never heard of the city of Quanzhou in China, even if you know a lot about Chinese history. And that is because today it's not very important. But between about 1100 and 1400, it was a hugely important port in China. In fact, it was probably the busiest port in the entire world. And so we are asking the lesson historical investigation question for students: why was Quanzhou such an important site of encounter? What we mean by a site of encounter is a place where people from different cultures met. And at this place, they exchanged products, ideas, and technologies. And that also at sites of encounter, very often new products, new ideas, and new technologies were developed out of the synthesis of multiple cultures. So what we want students to recognize about Quanzhou is all of the things that happened at this Chinese port city that made it possible for different ethnic groups to interchange ideas and products, all of the things that happened there, all of the things that were traded in this particular place, and the things, structures that help members of different ethnic groups get along together. All right. Now, the written sources that we have about Quanzhou come from travelers' accounts. The very famous traveler Marco Polo went there in the 13th century, and the sort of less famous Ibn Battuta, the Muslim traveler, went there in the 14th century. We also have 3 accounts written by Chinese who lived there, by Hong Mei, Zhao Liyue, and then some inscriptions from statues and on the side of temples and so forth. Now, these bring up the problem that you run into with a lot of primary sources. None of these sources were written in order to get students to understand why Quanzhou is an important site of encounter. And so how do we have to get the students from these sources to the question that we want them to answer. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is to actually work on comprehension with them with close reading. The first reading that they're going to do is not going to be about the focus question at all. It's going to be about what's obvious from the reading, and that is the question, what interested Ibn Battuta about Quanzhou? So if you will follow along while I read, in every city of China is a quarter where the Muslims live separately and have mosques for their Friday prayers and other assemblies. They are highly regarded and treated with respect. The Chinese infidels eat the meat of pigs and dogs and sell it in the bazaars. They live comfortably in an affluence but take little care about their food and clothing. You will see an important merchant whose wealth is beyond reckoning, wearing a tunic of coarse cotton. All the Chinese pay attention only to gold and silver vessels. Every one of them has a walking stick on which to lean when walking, and they call it the third leg. So here, this nothing, students are sort of overwhelmed by all of this information about the city. So the first thing they're going to do is to read through, and we're going to discuss what interested Ibn Battuta about Quanzhou. In the second reading, they're going to have a copy of the text, and they have to mark it up using cognitive markers. And we also encourage them to write words and definitions and questions in the margins. So we use this text markers to kind of get them through. Again, the whole point is comprehension, getting them to just understand what the text says. Now, here's an activity that I would like you to do. So this is on your handout, okay, so that you have a copy you can write on. And in this, for the third reading, we want to take students through parts of the reading which are really difficult for them to understand. Now, so in the paragraph here, Ibn Battuta used many referrers. Now, referrers are the kind of sort of general words that English learners often get mixed up on. They often don't understand what it refers to. So we have students go through it and write down who is they, what is meant by each referrer. Okay, so take a minute and do that on your handout.
Shannon, just a time check. We're a bit tight on time. I think we're about 1 minute left in this section.
Very good. I will probably be 2 minutes over, and I apologize for that.
No worries, and thanks everyone for the great chat. We appreciate it.
All right, if you look at this, you will see that, you go through, and sometimes it refers to Chinese officials, sometimes to foreign merchants. Now, what I would do with students is to take them through this paragraph, focusing on their answers that they have written down, but also taking the opportunity to discuss with them this whole foreign concept of confiscation by officials and forfeiting to the Treasury and all this kind of stuff, so that they actually understood what was going on in this this kind of activity that they would have absolutely no relationship to. Finally, we would ask text-dependent questions. And this is the text-dependent question exactly applicable to the reading the section you just analyzed. And that is, if a merchant or ship captain broke the law by not reporting his merchandise on the manifest and not paying the duty, what was the punishment? So that they would have to understand this particular, the importance of this particular reading that they had done. All right, now after all that is aside for each of the readings, now it's time for them to look at the question. So what we would have students do is in the first column of the chart to write down a reason. Why was Quanzhou such an important site of encounter? So they would write the reason in their own words in the first column. Then in the second column, they would write down a quote from the reading, an exact quote, a piece of evidence, and evidence to support the reason. And then in the third column, the analysis. They have to explain what the evidence means and how it supports the reason, again, in their own words. So now they would fill up a chart like this for each of the readings that I reviewed in the beginning of this section. Just to show you really quickly, in this lesson, there's also a writing task where they have to write 2 paragraphs on why Quanzhou was such an important site of encounter. In this case, we wanted students to really focus in on evidence and analysis. And so we actually gave them the reasons, and they just have to fill in a certain blanks in the reasons. And very scripted discussions on writing down the evidence, and then they can copy the analysis from their other charts. And for the English learners, a writing scaffold. That is where there are exactly, they just have to fill in the blanks and with sentence starters to show them proper historical language to use when they're developing the writing. And then they have to copy the paragraph over themselves. All right, I'm finished with this section. My apologies for going over. And so I think with this chat that it's now no longer my responsibility. I think that your chat leader is going to be...
Hi, Shannon.
I'm sorry. It still is Stacy. Stacy is going to moderate the chat.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I think we had a question from Christine. I tried to answer it, but I think maybe you can go into more detail. Can you explain either the difference between historical investigative questions and an essential question, or just give a little bit more detail about how we use historical investigation questions?
I don't believe that there really is a difference between an essential question and a historical investigation question in generality. That is, both of them serve the same purpose of focusing students on what is important. A historical investigation question is maybe specific to the discipline in that you want to make it something that is sort of gripping and interesting to that particular subject. For example, an essential question might be broader than you would want to use. For example, with sites of encounter, we wanted to use this idea of what happens in places where people meet and interact, people from different ethnic groups. So we specified the question to that particular model. And I'll also show you when we do the additional activities, I'll show you how we actually use historians' debates to shape the questions that we ask for the My Lai lesson and for the one on Lincoln speeches. So very often we use historical debates to frame them, to come up with the question.
Thank you, Shannon. And we have another question from Avelina. She's a 10th grade teacher at the high school. And just one last question. She's a little bit concerned about giving students so many frames and how they'll learn to do this independently.
Well, I totally understand. What I would think it was, if you gave them a lot of frames, you would have to, one, choose which frames they needed, and two, to gradually begin to withdraw them. So I would just really, do it on the basis of your own intuition. That is, if you knew your students were struggling with a particular issue, make a frame or use the frame that is needed for that. If they don't need it, don't give it to them. You know, and in particular, I wouldn't even do the English language frame for every student. Maybe that would be something that some of the students could use and some other students wouldn't have to use it at all. You know, I don't think scaffolds should be used, certainly not continually as a crutch. The idea is to get them to internalize that frame. And actually, I have used them in the first time I assign college writing. Sometimes I do those frames as well. And then the second time, maybe I say, write down your evidence and analyze it. You know, they don't even need the frame.
Well, thank you so much. And we've had some good comments from Stephanie and Victoria and others that are similarly talking about how they start to remove scaffolding after the students need it. So it looks
Absolutely.
like we've addressed most of the questions. I think we can move on to the next section. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Stacy. And thank you, all of you, for your questions and really thoughtful responses. All right, well, now we're going to pick up to the high school and look at a particular activity with primary sources from the Cold War unit. So the Cold War unit is designed for both 10th and 11th grade. And in 10th grade world history and 11th grade U.S. history both cover the Cold War. So there are particular lessons in each particular lessons in the unit designed for world history and designed for U.S. history. So this is from lesson 4, designed for the U.S. history, and that focuses entirely on the war in Vietnam. And this activity uses, as we will see, close reading strategies, citing evidence, and writing, just as the previous lesson did, and using multiple primary sources. But it also is a way of getting at analyzing point of view. Now, I bring this up for those of you who are history social science teachers or concerned about history and social science. And that is, sometimes we think in history social science that the Common Core is a huge distraction from history. But, you know, that really, I believe that the Common Core can actually help us achieve what we want to do in history social science. That is, history is not really about memorization of information. It's about understanding different viewpoints and understanding how to analyze and gather evidence to support interpretation. So presenting it in that way, actually, Common Core skills, or at least a lot of them, can directly support the kinds of things we want to do in history instruction. And so this is an example of what we're doing with the My Lai massacre thing. That is, what happened from a bunch of different perspectives. Okay, so now's your quick poll. Have you had your students analyze multiple primary sources? And so this would be more than one primary source on the same topic. So I'll give you a minute to do your quick poll, but just a minute. No, I don't want to give you too long.
So please check either the green mark or the red mark, or answer yes or no in the chat box. Thank you.
Okay. Now, I see that Victoria said that she did, and so did Scott Grantham. Very good, very good. I like that. A lot of people, Susan Smith, and a lot of people might say no from the question of time. That is, it does take time to do this, but remember, one of the things that I make no pretense whatsoever is if you do this kind of instruction, it is definitely going to take time. So let me give you a little bit of introduction about the activity. First, I'm assuming most of you have some knowledge about the My Lai massacre that occurred during the Vietnam War, when a group of American soldiers who'd been through some terrible experiences ended up killing villagers who were civilians during the contest, and the story was initially covered up and then broke on the news, and had a huge, huge impact on the way that Americans viewed the war and how they viewed the soldiers who were veterans of the war. Right. So this particular activity has 5 different sources. So one of the sources is a set of pictures from Life magazine that I can't show them to you because of copyright, but you've probably seen them. And that is, these are the photos that broke in Life magazine showing the bodies and what had happened at My Lai. Very, very famous. The second source is the testimony of, the second source is the testimony of Lieutenant William Calley, who was the man who was ultimately convicted of being responsible for the massacre and taking part in it. And the section of the testimony that is given is the atrocities that he had witnessed happening to his company before the massacre, and a discussion of his feelings at having seen these horrific sights. And this, there's another testimony source also of a survivor of the massacre, Nguyen Hue, who testified to a commission. Both of these testimonies have a Q&A format, which is an example of something that might kind of throw your English learners. That is, that they may look at that, need to understand what is actually happening during that kind of source, that kind of source. The third source is a type of source is an autobiography by Lewis Puller, who had been a soldier during Vietnam, who lost both legs and one arm during the war, and who talked about his reactions to the episode that he had not taken part in. And then the final one is the report of the commission that investigated the event. So these are really, really different kinds of sources, and every one of them comes from a somewhat different perspective about the event. Okay, so our key here is, how do we get students through these different primary sources? Well, one of the things that we can do in the beginning is to put students into a group and have the group of students assign the primary sources amongst themselves. And in this way, students whose English learners can take the photographs, they can take one of the testimonies is shorter than the other. Some of the readings are more difficult, some are easier. So this is something that can sort of balance out the skill levels in the group, and they can all help each other. What everyone has to do is to compile notes and fill in the chart for their particular source, and then to share the results with the group. And everyone in the group has to record the report on their charts. Okay, so when they fill in the chart, they will be looking at 2 important aspects. The first is, what is the perspective of the source? That is, who was this person? What did they think about the massacre? You know, what shoes were they standing in to observe what happened? And then secondly, what their information tells us. What important information do they give about what our historical investigation question, which is, what happened at My Lai? What was, what was the question, whose fault it was, or whatever. So I want you to try this for yourself. This is also on your activity page. It is 2 paragraphs from the autobiography. This is by Lewis Puller, whose autobiography was named Fortunate Son. And what I would like you to do is to read these 2 paragraphs and then pretend that you were a student filling out the chart. However, since our time is limited, I only want you to fill out or to think about one question, and that is, what was the source's perspective about the My Lai massacre? What was the perspective? Okay, so please take a couple of minutes to read this and then write down, what is this source's perspective about the My Lai massacre? Okay, I am looking at the chat that comments, and I'm really struck. I want to get back to Patricia's and Rudolph's comments about the picture, but let me take a moment to talk about the answer to the question here. That is, Carmen says that My Lai doesn't, his point of view is that My Lai does not represent the work of American soldiers and Marines, okay? Rudolph, his perspective of one who was there and served with many who also served. That's right, right. I'm also really, really struck by the power of the media, as I was, of course, during the Vietnam War as well, that the really important concept of this being the war that's shot on television. Okay, and Gay says the media skewed an accurate portrayal of how the soldiers actually behaved. That's right. And Louis Fuller stands in sort of for all of those soldiers who were absolutely horrified by the events and the blame for that. I also wanted to respond to what Patricia said about the photo of the youngest man to serve. I did not know that was the youngest man to serve in the war. One of the things that we all those photos that we have here, the selection process, a lot of it had to do with the small pool of photographs that we were able to use without copyright restrictions, that's very, very difficult for Vietnam because of the copyright laws. But I think it is very interesting to look at that young man in that way, and how wonderful that to be able to use those visual sources to point out to your students the way that media shapes our perceptions of the war. Okay, yeah, so anyway, with Louis Fuller, his example really shows that kind of a subtle difference in the perspective, because you can't just label it as an American point of view, but a point of view of a particular American in this particular situation. Okay, so I'm going to go on now and explain to you what happens when with the writing there. All right, now after students have gone through the 5 different sources and they have read one intensively, taken notes on it intensively, and then they have listened to their, the people in their group report and have written down on their charts what each group reports. At the end of all of that and the discussion that goes with it is a writing assignment. And what students have to do in this writing assignment is to write a paragraph about what happened in Vietnam and My Lai, what they think happened at My Lai. They have to cite evidence from each of the primary sources. And then they also have to explain why My Lai was important. Okay? So what they would be doing here is, I don't have a lot of a frame for you to do this, but again, they would have to pull out one piece of evidence from each primary source to tell the story of what, to give the narrative and their interpretation of Vietnam, what happened at My Lai. They would have to give an interpretation of the event and to use the evidence from the sources to back up their interpretation of it. So again, this is giving them the training. Now this would be a pretty good example too of how you are not necessarily giving them a scaffold to do it. It's a scaffold in the sense that they got support and explanation from the people that were in their group, but it's not a scaffold that tells them how to write up different schemes of evidence. Okay, it's also an example of a way that you could do it that doesn't require an entire essay. In this case, it's a long paragraph that they have to write. It's easier to grade. Okay. So I would like to ask you to write down, in this quick write, okay, what you think the advantages of having students read multiple primary sources and make interpretations on them. What do you think would be the advantages to your students? And what do you think would be the disadvantages or the challenges to the students? Okay? And I would like you, please, to feel free to ask any questions and also to share solutions. I see that many of you have been using multiple primary sources, and you probably have solutions that we could all benefit from. Okay, Kimberly says, multiple perspectives are great and students can get overwhelmed. That's true. Historical analysis from many perspectives, this can be very overwhelming, and we do have to keep them grounded. And April says, it's a disadvantage finding the sources. Absolutely, and you know something, that's exactly what we at the History Project would like to help you with. We have a lot of ideas about what sources you might use. Brian says, an advantage is that they understand that there's more than one perspective to an event. Yes, absolutely. Okay, students need to see one event from many different perspectives, Evelina says. Okay, Sonia says to develop critical thinking skills and develop different point of view. Rachel, different perspectives helps consider different viewpoints. It takes a long time, but it is so worth it. Absolutely. You're totally right, Rachel, on both of those points. So, you know, it's interesting, Rudolph, saying by reading the primary sources, students don't have to deal with the point of view of historians and textbook writers. Absolutely. And you know something, you can cover a lot of ground. They know an awful lot about Vietnam after they have read these documents, even though it focuses in on one little issue. There's so many things that they are able to do. Let's see, Victoria says there are many advantages to having students read multiple sources. One advantage, it allows students to critically analyze documents and to be able to recognize and understand different perspectives. Oh, so well said, thank you. Multiple, Anne says, it allows for multiple views and points of entry into the information. Absolutely, thank you so much. All right, now I'd like to turn it over to the moderator, Stacy, for questions.
Well, Shannon, you've been doing such a wonderful job reviewing the chat. I'd like to make sure, though, we have a chance for folks to enter any questions or any solutions that you, maybe you have some solutions to some of the challenges that some folks have listed here. So please go ahead and take time to enter questions and solutions into the chat as we go on. But I do want to say that Lori had a good point that one of the advantages is to use visual text, is the use of visual text as a source for our English learners to help them access it and enter it. And I totally agree. It helps everyone get into the lesson and everything as long as we help them support them with the language that they need to address the standard. So thank you for everything that is working.
Lori, could I also say, too, that one of the Q&A, one of the testimonies is very simple as well, and I think it accomplishes that purpose, too. It's short text for the English learner, you know, something that just doesn't overwhelm them with a volume. It is also very helpful.
Yeah, and Laura has a good point. Did you see Laura's comment? She has a solution called a double read.
Excellent.
She says that, for example, in a double read, student 1 reads documents A and B, student 2 reads documents B and C, 3 reads C and D, and 4 reads D and A. So they're overlapping the readings, but this works best, of course, when documents are short. So students do that. And I think Gay comments that it also assists ELs in their understanding and building academic language and content understanding simultaneously. And I think that is so important because we're trying to make sure that our students get access to the language resources they need.
Absolutely.
And Shannon, what's your take on this question from Justin? Is using a movie clip from Hollywood a legitimate use of a source as long as it's accurate?
I think sometimes it's legitimate even if it isn't accurate, you know? As long as they understand that it's a movie and it accomplishes different, the goals that you want to achieve, I think it's legitimate. I do it. That is, I give them a specific purpose for watching, and I say, you know, what is the interpretation of this film? You know, what is being shown here, and ask them to look at movie making critically. And I think this is what film studies at the university level is all about, kind of understanding that. So I wouldn't hesitate if you think it's useful for students, and just make sure that they do the sourcing questions about it. You know, who produced it? that they understand that it wasn't meant, it isn't going to be accurate, that it's going to be shaped in a certain way, and it should be fine.
Mm-hmm. And we actually have another teacher who is interested in the copyright. You mentioned the copyright, and that she noticed that most of the images and sources are from the Library of Congress and the National Archives. And I think, especially as history teachers, we're always concerned about sourcing our materials. Can you speak to those resources for using documents?
Absolutely. Library of Congress is one of our partners on the History Blueprint, and they just have incredible resources there. So if you have not looked at their different photo collections in particular, I strongly advise you to look at their photo and poster collections that are online. They can be overwhelming because there are so many of them. There are many sources that are under copyright, but a lot of times the copyright is not, there's something called fair use, and that is if an individual teacher is using something for instruction in their classroom and it's not being spread any further, there really isn't too many, very often that is a legal use of them, whereas us posting it on the website would not be a legal use of it. There are also great sources available at different historical archives, and even in world history you can get things from the museums. A lot of museums have collections that are online, and different kinds of things like that. It is, I think, really smart to find out where things are from and to teach your students to always ask, who put this up? When was this made? What do we know about this? Because there's so much misinformation about that, sources out there. Okay, that is, I see people are writing a lot about what movies are good for different subjects, and I think that it's great to use movies and text and so forth, but just make sure you use small portions of them and that you have students do analysis as they go along, because otherwise they just assume you're showing them a movie.
Yes, it's so important.
You know,
it's so important to say, you know, who's the author, who's the director, who's the writer of this script, and what's their purpose and what's the context of when it's done, just like you would other historical sources. So thank you, Shannon. I think we're ready to go ahead and go to the next section.
All right. Well, thank you. Let's go ahead. Great. So this section is going to focus again on the skills of close reading, citing evidence, and writing. And it also is going to focus on point of view, but this time not point of view of multiple people, but the point of view of one individual person, Abraham Lincoln, and how that changed or didn't change over time. And so I've highlighted analyzing point of view and change over time because those are concepts that history social science teachers are very interested in pursuing because of the importance to our discipline. So this is the very first History Blueprint unit that we did. It is for 8th grade U.S. history, and it's in a unit on the Civil War. And it is lesson 5 in that unit, analyzing Lincoln's speech. So here is the particular California History Social Science content standard that inspired this lesson. This rather interesting standard asked students to discuss Abraham Lincoln's presidency and his significant writings and speeches and their relationship to the Declaration of Independence. And then it gives a long list of the different speeches that he made. And this, I would think, is rather overwhelming to an 8th grade teacher. The first being, you know, Lincoln was an absolutely phenomenal writer and a great leader, but his speeches were written in a kind of a language that doesn't translate directly to the modern 8th grader. His works were complicated and his ideas deeply biblical, his language complex and beautiful, and getting through 5 different speeches can be quite a challenge. So we decided in approaching this, though, that it was a great way to get students to form an interpretation about a very important historical question. And in this case, we chose our interpretive question directly related to a debate that came in the minds of historians. Okay, so this question has to do with Lincoln himself and has to do with whether or not Lincoln really meant to free the slaves from the beginning. And that is, at the beginning of the war, Lincoln said he was involved in the war because he wanted to keep the Union together. He wanted to keep it together. He said before the war started that he had no intention of abolishing slavery. Now, the fact that the southern states didn't believe him doesn't change the fact that he himself never meant to free the slaves according to his own language. Then, of course, halfway through the war, the Emancipation Proclamation comes out, and the question is there: did he free the slaves because he believed it, or did he do it for political reasons? And then the deeper question comes to: did he free the slaves at all, or, as many historians say today, did they free themselves? Was the action that led to the freeing of the slaves, did it come from the top down, from something that Lincoln did, or did it come from the bottom up, that is something that the slaves themselves did and the Union sort of had to cope with? Now, so all of these things were in our minds, and we're thinking about these really complicated historical issues, really important issues, but complicated. And how do you ask an 8th grader a question like that? Okay, so the question that we ask them for each of the speeches is, why did Lincoln fight? What reason did Lincoln give for fighting the war in this speech? And then they go through the speeches and record what reason Lincoln gave for fighting it. And then at the end of the 5 speeches, they answer the question, did Lincoln's reasons for fighting the war change over time? All right? So we did the question in this kind of simplified way, or kind of a way that designed to access 8th grade logic, to have them have an idea and then go to this historical investigation question, thinking that in the beginning, either we wanted them to really look at the text for those reasons before they sort of jump to an easy conclusion. All right. So the first thing that we do is we go through the readings, which I'm not going to take you through all 5. But the first thing we do is to have students approach them is to give them a word cloud. Now, word clouds are really useful documents in that the size of the word indicates how many times it's used in the speech. So the bigger the word is in the speech, the more often the word is used in the speech, the bigger it appears on the Wordle. So we go through and ask students, take a look at this word cloud and make a prediction. What do you think this speech is going to be about? Right? And so, students look at it and they say, well, I think it's probably about the government and about the Constitution and the people and the states and so forth. So they kind of make a little prediction and write it down. Okay. Next, students go through a small excerpt of the speech. Now, in this section is a 2-paragraph excerpt from the first inaugural address. You'll see that it's a very famous passage. It says, I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourself being the aggressors. You have no oath to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battleground and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone over all this broad land will yet swell the chords of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. That's just so absolutely beautiful and magnificent writing of Lincoln, just incredible. But tough for 8th graders to understand, very, very tough. All right, the reason that one sentence, "you have no oath," is bolded is that is the sentence by which they can get the absolute core meaning in the speech, that they can directly answer the question with this tough sentence. So we use a strategy down below called sentence deconstruction. The purpose of sentence deconstruction is to get English learners and students with weak reading skills to look very closely at one piece of text, to break it down into its component parts, and therefore understand it better. So the sentence is broken up into the circumstances column, the historical actors column, the verb or verb phrase column, and then the who, what, where, or the message column. And then the final column, questions or conclusions, they answer after they have filled in the box. So students go through and it says, you have, and then they would write in no oath to destroy the government in the who, what, where box. Okay? And while I, Lincoln, shall have the most solemn one to preserve and protect and defend it. Notice in here that every time it uses a pronoun, you or I or it, that in parentheses, it's being defined for them. Then once they have looked at the sentence and, you know, the teacher has talked them through what does that mean, you know, what did Lincoln say, that the states didn't have an oath, but he, Lincoln, has an oath. His oath is to protect and defend the government. Okay. And then they answer the question, what was Lincoln's oath? Okay, he swears to uphold the Union. Why does he say that the seceded states have no oath? Okay, and then students, because they decided to leave the Union and they didn't have to. All right, so once students have really slowed down and read that key sentence, then they are ready to answer the question of, you know, what was his reason for fighting the war? Okay, well, there is no war at this point. So we say, why would he fight the war? If the Union, in order to preserve the Union. Okay? And then students are because they understand, they can go ahead and write down that meaning. Okay?
Shannon, we have a question from Stephanie.
Yeah, go ahead.
She says, does the teacher select the sentence to deconstruct first to model a protocol for students to be able to do it later in small groups or independently?
Yeah, I would model it at first. The teachers that use this all the time with their students start out the beginning of the year teaching them how to do the sentence deconstruction, and then after a while just tells them, just hands it to them and has them fill it out. You know, I would definitely model it with students and run through that, because you want them to come to the understanding of it, because like Gregory said, yes, it is a lot like English, but notice that you're also getting across the history. You know, absolutely, by the end of the time that you've gone through that sentence, they know what he said. And to me, I would never do this if it was something that was just grammar. But if it's grammar in the service of history, it doesn't bother me.
And Shannon, I also like the point that as a teacher, you're picking out the most important sentences to do, so the students really walk away with the heart of the meaning of the primary source. Not any sentence, but the teacher really has to select the most important ones to analyze.
Absolutely, and that brings me back to the point that I made in the beginning too, when I said, be really clear what you want students to get out of it. Be really clear what the outcome is. And you know, if you're clear in your mind, then you can get it across to them. If you're not clear in your mind, then the discussion will go all over the place. Because if you're not clear, they won't be either. Okay, so then you ask them the text-dependent question. How did the speech relate to the Declaration of Independence? What was Lincoln arguing? What does this tell us about his reasons for fighting the war? There are other supports for the first two questions in the activity that I'm not showing you, just so you know. There are other supports to help students answer those. Well, now skipping forward a couple of speeches and 3 years, we come to the Gettysburg Address. This is a word cloud for the Gettysburg Address. the Gettysburg Address, of course, comes after at the dedication of the battlefield for the soldiers who died at Gettysburg. It comes after the Emancipation Proclamation, and the students could predict from this that there is a very different set of a very different, kind of idea about what the reason for fighting the war is at this juncture. Maybe not entirely different because the word nation is there and the word that people is there, but you also have this very large dedicated and devotion and so this language that did not appear at first. So the sentence, we give them in this activity the entire Gettysburg Address. It's not that long and it's just so important. But this is the sentence that we have highlighted. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. All right, now what I would like you to do is to take this one sentence and tell us, try it yourself. What does this tell us about Lincoln's reasons for fighting the war? Try this one yourself.
Please go ahead and try to answer that question in the chat. So what does this tell us? What does this speech tell us about Lincoln's reasons for fighting the war? Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on what Stephanie said. The why could be surrounding the idea that words and phrases have power in their structure and authors choose words to make change. And this is what's really important about using the sentence deconstruction in that way, is these texts were written with careful attention to word choice. And our students read, they either read superficially or they read so quickly or they just go for the gist. They sometimes do not notice the exact word for it. Sometimes we have to slow them down in order to do it. Now, maybe sentence deconstruction is going too far, particularly if you teach high school. You may think that it's not a strategy that you want to use. But slowing students down to look at specific phrases in a particular sentence and to explain the meaning in some way in their own words can be a really powerful strategy. And this is actually what historians do if you think about it. They really look at language under a microscope and analyze and bring it across. Okay? Okay, so Aaron wrote, to reunite the country once again devoted to liberty and inalienable rights. Okay. To preserve democracy. Peter says that while many soldiers have died, our resolve to win this war should never die, and we should continue on in the honor and the freedom of America. Change over time comes to mind. Well, let me ask you this question. What does a new birth of freedom mean? When he's talking about a new birth of freedom, what does that mean? And Justin says freedom for everyone. Okay, so this is really interesting. He obviously has keeping that idea of the preserving the Union, honoring the dead by continuing the attack. But then there's this little part about the new birth of freedom. That freedom somehow now the war is being fought for freedom, not only for the Union and these other reasons. What we do with students next after they go through the 5 speeches is asking them to make an interpretation. And now what in this activity, again, kind of a structure for the 8th graders to get them to understand how to formulate an interpretation. So A, B, and C are three possibilities that they might argue. A, they could argue that Lincoln had one reason for fighting the war in the beginning, but by the end he changed his reason. The B says, in all of his speeches, Lincoln had the same reason for fighting the war. And then the C says, in the beginning, Lincoln argued that the reason for fighting was one thing, but by the end of the war, he added a reason or reasons, and then they have to fix. Okay, so the students are supposed to choose from one of the three possibilities and fill in the blanks and then copy over their interpretation. Now, this is going to be very tough for them, so obviously the teacher would have to discuss this with students and ask them, you know, is he changing his reasons? Do you think he's adding a reason? Do you think his reason is always the same? And getting them to look at the evidence of the 5 speeches that they have gone through. Okay, so in this writing activity. And then what students do is write an essay answering this question. Okay, so second setup, after they've done the interpretation, they collect the evidence. This is another example of an evidence gathering chart. And in this case, the first column gives the structure for change over time. That is, change over time posits that there was one thing in the beginning, then there was a point of change, and then in the end, there's a difference. So in the beginning, what was Lincoln's reason for fighting the war in the beginning, right, from the first 2 speeches? What was the point of change? So when and how did Lincoln's reasons change? And then in the end, what was Lincoln's reason for fighting the war in the end? And then that would be from the last 2 speeches. So in the first column, they list a piece of evidence to support each of these points. Then they analyze the evidence. In the fourth column, they say they look at how does this support your interpretation, and then finally they write down the citation information, which of the speeches that it came from. All right. Now the whole idea here is to get them to collect the evidence before they start writing in that way. So this is what we call an EARS chart, after evidence, analysis, relevance, and sort. And you can thank Stacy for these because you know, I'm just sort of copying her really good guidance in this area. So what you have students do here is sort of line out their evidence before they write. And they often feel very, very confident when they go into writing because they know what it is that they have to say. All right, I am winding up by saying the following. First, I suggest that not all the time, but maybe once in a unit or once every month, you assign multiple primary sources to your students to answer an engaging and significant historical investigation question, something that will grab their attention because, you know, otherwise they, you don't want to do this on something that is going to be boring. That you give support to your English learners and those readers that you have that are reading below grade level, that to make them, especially just to make them understand what's going on in the comprehension, and then they can do the analysis. And to remember that this is definitely going to take time, and to that message that you just cannot do this kind of work, or I believe any kind of significant Common Core work, without taking making the investment of quality time in doing so. Okay, the last question is a follow-up question for you, and that is, what history units or topics in the California History Social Science Standards for your grade level would be appropriate for this set of strategies?
Okay, so if everyone can just think about how you're using in your content area, what units could you start looking at applying these types of strategies towards would be really helpful. And then we will have a moment to go back and address a few of the questions that have come up through the chat as Shannon's been presenting. So Thank you, Justin, for responding McCarthyism. I think that can help us get started. So let's start with these type of topics. What topics would be good for multiple primary sources, multiple primary source investigation?
Sixth grade ancient civilization. Oh, Consuelo, I'll tell you, that you're near and dear to my heart here. I think it would be excellent to use different sources from Hammurabi and also to use some of the texts that come out of Egypt in talking about that. And of course, the great Greek documents. I have students sometimes look at the text from the founding of the Hebrews and compare that with Chinese documents from the similar time period. It's very interesting to have them do ancient civilizations. So founding of America, very good. Manifest Destiny, Civil War, excellent. The Spanish-American War, absolutely. Medieval world history to the Reformation. Ah, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Now, the Reformation would be rough because of the documents. The documents in that are so difficult to understand, but little snippets that talk about the particular doctrines of each of the reformers, Luther and Calvin and so forth, I think could be very effective. That's a really good example of where you would have to be very selective. All right, oh, this is so exciting. You guys have got a zillion ideas. Wonderful.
So Shannon, I want to go take us back to the question that Justin had about sentence deconstruction. I know we've kind of moved on from that, but Justin's question is about how do you keep students engaged when you're doing the sentence deconstruction? How do you make sure that students care about it and apply and can apply it to their lives? How do you help keep students looking at the relevance of learning those types of strategies when it seems so English-focused?
I have two answers. One, make it short. That is, and second, I don't know that I would use it a whole lot, particularly at the higher level. I think that perhaps if you had them look at it in such a way that they were just looking at one sentence and so forth, I wouldn't want to do it too long. That's one thing. Secondly, I think if you give them an engaging question and you tell them at the end of it, I'm going to ask you what your interpretation of this is, they always sit up and pay attention when I say that because I'm asking them what they think. And if I say to them in the beginning, I'm going to give you 3 or 4 readings and we go over what they mean, and in the end I'm going to ask you to pick, to talk about what the point of view of each of these is, my students are always paying attention with that because it's like I'm going to ask them in the end to shape something with it. And if I say to them, your interpretation is important, that you can be a historian, I think that carries a lot with them. I think they enjoy that. But so I would say those two things. 1, keep it short, and 2, make it, try to sell them on the idea that they are historians. Okay.
Yeah, and some of the responses from teachers I worked with when I worked with Shannon at the History Project was also that students felt more empowered to break down complicated text, and it was really impressive to see them just after looking at a few sentences to walk away and then be able to apply those same kind of critical questions to other sentences and realize how just even honoring that text is complicated, we need to slow down and read it very carefully, really sort of empowered students with the language to talk about language and ask good questions in history. And I think some of the folks here have commented about how this really does address some of the EL standards. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Can I also add one point if I was saying that too? Is I think, Justin, sometimes we look at them and they're looking at us like they're bored and they don't get it. And sometimes if sentence deconstruction can help them understand it, then they feel very masterful. They feel like, oh, I can give an opinion because I really know what's going on. So some of that disinterest sometimes is a student going, this makes no sense to me. I don't know what to do with it. And sentence deconstruction can help with that.
So we'd really like to open up the questions and the chat box, though, to anybody who has questions about using multiple primary sources, historical investigation, the EARS strategy, or anything you've seen today. This is a great time to get those questions answered, or comments or solutions. One solution I wanted to make sure that folks saw was that Sonia Terry highlighted that she had gone to the Library of Congress's Summer Institute. And yes, those are some great places to study and access primary sources. And I want to plug that the California History Social Science Project puts on events through the Library of Congress, or with the Library of Congress also.
Excellent. Yes, and I guess let me just kind of go to, I know at least one person asked where are all these lessons. And one of the reasons that I gave you these 3 examples is they come from our History Blueprint curriculum developed by the California History Social Science Project. This is a free download for teachers anywhere. All of the materials you need in order to teach these activities. The activities, the word list, the documents, the visuals, everything that I've shown you today comes from these units that you'll see there together. We don't have that many of them, but what we've got is available for you, and we'd love to have you use it and let us know what you think in that regard. And just also know, too, that you can always email us at the California History Social Science Project and ask us for recommendations on primary sources. You know, we are really, really happy to show you anything that we could give you in that regard. To, we have historians that we can call on, to suggest sources to you, because we know that teachers don't always have time to, or don't ever have time to do all that work for themselves. So we're happy to support you in any way that we can. Okay, well, I think that let's see. If there's anybody who has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but I don't think I have any more with them.
Crystal mentions that she went to the medieval session over summer at UCLA, and she's asking if there's more sessions planned this year. And if you go to the chssp.ucdavis.edu website, you'll see lists of the programs that are offered at all the sites upcoming and in this upcoming this summer and also during the school year. So you can get access to professional development that's in your region, because they have sites throughout the state. You can tell I'm a fan. I spent 9 years working full-time for the UC Davis site, and I'm just so fun to be able to share this work with you all and be able to work with Shannon on this project.
Well, the feeling is definitely mutual, and I hope, if any of you have any questions about doing this, let us know. If you have any suggestions for us, let us know as well. And good luck with your students and doing this Common Core work. I tell you, it's exciting. It's very exciting.
And in just a minute, I have some other resources to share with you, but let's go ahead and just kind of summarize the webinar. Is that you, Shannon?
Yes, I guess so. Okay, so the first, we looked at close reading, citing evidence, and writing in 3 different lessons. A 7th grade lesson on Ibn Battuta and Quanzhou, a 11th grade lesson, What Happened at My Lai, and in that one we also looked at analyzing point of view and perspective. And then finally, in an 8th grade lesson on Lincoln speeches and looking at analyzing how his point of view changed over time. And so, this, hopefully I haven't overwhelmed you with all different strategies, but you can see that it's all basically tied around this bundle of skills: close reading, citing evidence, and writing. And I just think it's very powerful to be able to use that with your students in multiple primary sources. And thank you all for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Shannon, so much. This has been really fun, and I hope it seems like from the comments that, for example, Annette says that she has some things to try right away, and Justin's asking if this will be available to share with colleagues. And as Anu points out, this webinar will be recorded and posted tomorrow on the event page that she's listed in the box. We'd also like to highlight some resources that we've been working on here at the California Department of Education. The English Language Arts English Language Development Framework actually has 18 activities for history social science that shows snippets of how you can integrate the Common Core for literacy and the ELD standards in history social science. and you can download those after the first bullet. Towards the bottom of the page, you can click in and access the vignettes. Also, we have a Content Literacy and History Social Science 612 Professional Learning Module. There's also one for K-5, but since this is a secondary group, I'd like to highlight this one. There's some excellent videos and lessons from Reading Like a Historian and other resources on that module. Next, I have worked very hard to update the CDE's professional learning and curriculum resources. If you look at the third bullet, that link, there are, one of the bullets is a list of primary source houses, places you can go to download primary sources, as well as other types of resources by subject area. And finally, if you'd like to be added to the CDE's professional learning newsletter, be able to hear about the work at the History Project as well as other organizations throughout the state, you can send an email here at the bottom to join History Social Science, and you'll get a newsletter. However, if you go to the next page, I believe we also have our content information, and you can just email myself for any of the, to get added to that newsletter as well. Or you can contact the History Social Science Project or Shannon Hutton directly through these content areas.
Thank you very much, Stacy, for sharing those resources and for moderating the Q&A during discussion reflection time. I just wanted to ask if you can share what might be your first step or next step in transitioning to the CCSS. And please share those in the chat while we go over the webinars in this series. We've had content area webinars on science. We've also had 2 webinars on the ELD-ELA framework, which, and a number of you were mentioning working with ELLs as part of this important work on the Common Core. So I've pasted the archive of our first webinar this year, which was on the ELA-ELD framework, and the other one can be found at the Vimeo channel here. We also had one on addressing the needs of special needs students through team teaching, and as well as assessment. So I saw about assessment. You can check that one out. I'd like at this point to thank again Shannon Hutton, who graciously donated her time, so she's a busy professor, and Stacy Greer, our partner in the Secondary Literacy Partnership. I would also gratefully acknowledge the guidance of Julie Duffield, webinar director, on this project, as well as many webinars she's done through WestEd over the years. Next steps is we've pasted in a survey in the chat. Please click on that link and let us know your feedback on this webinar. And we do have a Secondary Literacy Partnership page on wested.org/schools-moving-up. So please look out for the webinars that we've done over the past 3 years, which are on that page. Thank you very much for all of you who stayed with us till late in the day, learning and sharing together. Again, the archive will be sent right after, well, within 24 hours of this webinar to all of those who signed up. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues and friends. And I'd like to ask Julie Duffield to say any final words, as this is the last webinar in our series this school year. And please, if you'll be receiving notice of upcoming webinars for the next school year, so stay tuned for our Secondary Literacy Partnership newsletter. Julie?
Oh, no, thank you, everyone. It's been so exciting. I've learned so much and appreciate this great webinar. And thank you, Stacy and Shannon. And Stacy, I'd like to give you the final word here. I know that folks are asking about the new standards. That might be a nice note to leave. to end on, and we look forward to seeing you and hearing from you, and sign up for the newsletter. Over to you, Stacy.
You've asked a question that I cannot possibly answer in only 0 seconds, but we need new legislation to be able to update the standards, and if that goes through, then we'll have a 2-year process to update the standards. We'll see how that moves forward. Currently, we're working on updating the History Social Science framework, and hopefully following that would be new instructional materials for K-8. So the question is, it depends on legislation, Justin, so we'll see about if that will happen. So thank you for that good question. And thank you to Shannon, Julie, Anu for running such a wonderful webinar, and we hope that you found lots of resources for integrating Common Core and ELD standards in your History Social Science classroom. So thank you, everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks, participants. And we're just in. Thank you, Shannon. It's very exciting, and we're ending today's webinar recording. And thank you all for working out there on the great work you do in History Social Science. It's very exciting and important work. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.